Good evening, everyone. And thank you for coming this evening to be part of this presentation of the E. Pauline Riall Lecture Series. My name is Tom Jones, and I am Provost of Salisbury University. Tonight we'll hear from Michael Tisserand, a journalist and author who tells the inspiring story of a teacher who made a difference and children who learned that education is critical, even and especially in the most dire of circumstances. Mr. Tisserand's story takes us all back to those painful days 2 years ago, just after Hurricane Katrina, when everyone in this country and the world witnessed a devastation to lives and property that we could only imagine at the time, and to the slow and shocking response to that devastation, which we could never imagine we would witness in a major city in the United States of America. But as sad as those days were, they were also galvanizing, and on college campuses across the country brought a new energy to our mission of service to the broader community. Here at Salisbury University, we welcome students from Tulane University and the University of New Orleans, whose campuses were host to the destruction of Katrina. We temporarily lost one student who left our campus to serve New Orleans as a member of the National Guard. One of our faculty traveled south as part of a well-mobiled crew to minister to the families who needed health care in the wake of the storm. And students, faculty, and staff of the university joined forces, collecting dollars, food, and cleaning supplies to assist our neighbors in those distressed areas. As is often the case, the tale of Hurricane Katrina, while a story of sadness, loss, and destruction, is also a story about hope, heroism, and triumph of the human spirit. And such a story is what you will hear tonight. My thanks to Michael Tisserand for writing that story, and to Dr. Dennis Patanachek, Dean of the Seidel School of Education and Professional Studies, and Laura Marasco, Chair of the Riall Committee, for bringing Michael and his story to Salisbury University. Most of all, we need to remember a great teacher, Paul Renaud, and the children of Sugarcane Academy. I can't think of a more appropriate focus for the Riall Lecture. And so without further delay, I would like to invite Dennis Patanachek to the podium. Dennis can tell a few stories himself about inspiring teachers. It's thanks to his good work and that of all of the faculty in the Seidel School that Salisbury University has proudly produced three, count them, 3 out of the last 5 Maryland Teacher of the Year honorees. To the faculty of the education, and Dennis, congratulations. And certainly to the dedication of all those honorees that were recognized. The latest was named just over a week ago. She is April Todd, a 6th grade language arts teacher at Somerset Intermediate School in Westover, and a graduate of Salisbury University's Master of Education program. So congratulations again, Dennis, and thank you for what you do every day for the students at Salisbury University. Dennis?
Thank you, Dr. Jones. I want to welcome you on behalf of the Seidel School of Education and Professional Studies, and it is my pleasure tonight to tell you a little bit about why we're here and how we got here. I want to tell you about the event, I want to tell you about the person, and I want to tell you about the difference. This event, is one of a kind. We believe it is the only lecture series of its stature at a college or university in the United States. If you look at the list of speakers since 1988, you will see a who's who of American education. I'm not going to start naming them because I would have to name them all. They represent the finest thinking in our field. Joining us tonight is a journalist, a noted journalist, who will tell a story about a teacher who made a difference. The person for whom this lecture series is named is Pauline Riall. Pauline Riall was the principal of the campus school that was located in Carruthers Hall from 1954 to the 1970s. According to an article that I dug up, written by our own Richard Culver, she lived, slept, and ate education. Every year for the Riall Lecture, I try to find a Pauline Riall story. And what I found out this year is the woman virtually was seen in every corner of Carruthers Hall by almost every student all the time. She was an imposing figure. She graduated from Nanticoke High School. She grew up on a farm in Tyaskin. And when she graduated, there was no Salisbury University. There was no school in Salisbury, and so she had to cross the bridge and attend normal school at Towson. From there, she went on to Columbia University, Teachers College, where she earned her bachelor's and her master's degree. She retired in 1969, and when she passed away, she left 3 major gifts to Salisbury University. One of those funded this lecture series. And that gift was made real by the work of the Education Department Chair, Morris Bosman, and with us tonight is his widow, Carol Bosman. Carol, would you stand, please? So I've told you about the event and the person, and I think I want to tell you about the difference. We have another lecture series called The Difference One Person Can Make. And when I think about this gift, I did a little bit of paper napkin math. We have had, math professor cheers. We have had over the years approximately 25,000 Salisbury students, most of them intending to be teachers, come to the Riall Lecture. If each of them taught only 20 students, well, you do the math. It's an impressive number, and we know that many of them teach 25 or 30 every year, and for the secondary teachers, many more than that. The number really approaches the millions. That's the difference one person could make through a gift. Tonight, to tell a story of the difference another person made is a gift as well, and we welcome Michael Tisserand. Welcome to you.
On behalf of the Riall Committee, I'd like to welcome you all to the second lecture of the 20th anniversary of the Riall Lecture Series. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to recognize the Riall Committee that helps with the selection and the organization of this series. And I would like that recognition with applause, but would you please hold it until everyone is mentioned, and will the Riall Committee please stand? Dr. Claudia Burgess, Dr. Ted Gilkey, Dr. Ken Milner, and Dr. Diana Wagner. Thank you. As I've said every year, this kind of event can't go on without full cooperation by so many departments around campus. And it's a long list. At least 15 departments on this campus contribute to making this event happen. So thank you, Salisbury University, for supporting the Seidel School and the Riall Series. And a special thanks to the Education Club, who helps with the book sales and the program distribution. A couple of housekeeping announcements. When the lecture has finished, books will be for sale in the lobby of Holloway Hall, and I cordially invite all of you, on behalf of the Riall Committee and the speaker, to join us in the social room for refreshments, and also Mr. Tisserand will be there for book signing. 2 of his books are on sale in the lobby. One is Sugarcane Academy, which he will speak about tonight, and the other book is called The Kingdom of Zydeco. He won the ASCAP Music Writing Award for this book, and it's all about Zydeco music in Louisiana. And I would urge all of you who are interested in music to take a look at this book. Tomorrow at 9:30 in the Great Hall, There will be a question and answer period, and there'll be a short summary of what Michael Tisserand talks about tonight, but also he wants to leave room for those of you who are interested in Zydeco to have an opportunity to ask music questions as well. Following that, he will be going to Professor Lou's world music class, and those of you who are in her classes, world music classes, will get to hear him speak again, but this time on Zydeco music. When the Riall Committee was first making its decision on who would be the Riall speaker for this fall, and Michael Tisserand's book and his name came before us, I was taken back to when I was in elementary school. I was getting ready to start 6th grade, and I was in Connecticut at my aunt and uncle's house, and my siblings were at all our other Italian aunts and uncles' houses. It was the end of summer, and everybody was doing their summer thing and school shopping and getting ready for the new school year. Hurricane Hazel came up the East Coast, and while it did not turn into a huge hurricane by the time it got to Connecticut, as in Katrina and New Orleans, the dams broke on the Housatonic River, and our family found ourselves totally separated by this huge rushing river, and no one could get to one another because we were separated on two different sides of the town. My grandmother's house was on the river, and I remember that we stood on the bluff on the other side as we watched the river rise, not knowing whether she got out of the house or whether she was still in it. And we didn't know for days what happened to her. And even after we were able to find out from the Red Cross that she had been taken to a shelter against her will because she didn't want to leave what was hers, and everything that was hers in the world was in that house, we still couldn't reunite. And it was weeks before we came together again. And I remember as a 6th grader, this fear that I had that our family would be displaced and we would never find each other again. And as I watched Katrina unfold on the news, that fear resurrected in me, and I grieved for what I saw. I know lots of you have participated in, as Dr. Jones said, fundraising. Some of you have gone to the Gulf Coast. The Education Club 2 years ago put 44 boxes of supplies together for school kids. And I'm really proud of Salisbury University for the commitment that they made. But we'll see tonight that Katrina happened 2 years ago, but its effects still linger. And I think one of the things that we think about tonight, we know New Orleans for Mardi Gras, we know New Orleans for the jazz, we know New Orleans by Bourbon Street and Basin Street and its music and cuisine, but in post-Katrina, we have questions now, and those questions come to us in education. What does a disaster like that look through the eyes of a child, through a parent, through a teacher? And tonight, Michael Tisserand is going to take us on that journey so we know what has happened, what continues to take place, and what the healing process is. Please help me welcome Michael Tisserand.
Thank you, Dr. Jones, Dr. Patanachek, Dr. Marasco, and to the Riall Committee and its friends and supporters. Looking on the back of the program at the past 20 years of speakers, it read like a list of many of my personal heroes. Jonathan Kotzel had spoken in New Orleans just a couple months before Katrina. And those scenes of poverty that we all witnessed and many people professed to be shocked by were described very clearly by Mr. Kotzel before us at that talk in New Orleans. He's seen it for quite some time in New Orleans and other cities and is going around reminding us that it's there. No one can really claim because of him and others that we're shocked that there is poverty like that in our great country. Before I begin, I want to start with a brief slideshow of photographs taken by a good friend of mine named David Ray Morris. I recommend his book, My Mississippi, which he did with his father, Willie Morris. David Ray is in New Orleans. He lives in the Bywater area, not far from the 9th Ward. He evacuated with his child and his wife, but got back to New Orleans very soon after to shoot these photos. They haven't been published. Most of them haven't been seen before, but he's letting me show them here. And I think I'm just going to go and start those photos, and then we'll start talking after that.
lost in the flood.
last picture was a self-portrait of the photographer. I recommend to anybody to go to davidraymorris.org. He has a lot of his own slideshows up on his website. I'm a journalist. I was editor of the weekly newspaper Gambit Weekly for 7 years before Katrina, and then I've been writing only about New Orleans and Louisiana, both post-Katrina politics and Louisiana culture in the past 2 years. And I had the experience, just a few months ago, I had a story that I was working on for a magazine out of New York, and it had been assigned and approved and discussed, and the price and the fee and arranged, and then I wasn't getting my emails returned back, and I finally called and finally got a call back, and the editor I was working with said, well, I don't know how to tell you this, but people around here are getting Katrina fatigue. This was after the second-year anniversary, after the time that people sort of want to come out with articles. I want to thank again this college and everyone here for not succumbing to Katrina fatigue. Indeed, now is the time, more than any possible time, to start paying attention to what's happening in Louisiana and coastal Mississippi, also represented in David Ray Morris's photos. Last week I was riding around to some of the FEMA trailers around the Baton Rouge, Louisiana area, where there still are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of families living in trailers, in parks, out on bleached gravel lots, far away from services and stores and shops, and very far away from the life they know and love. I was talking with a guy who works for Catholic Charities. He's the head of disaster relief services there, and he said, you know, the first time that someone died in one of these trailers, it really bothered me, because the person died of natural causes. The person, wasn't killed, but it really bothered me because there's no place for someone to die all alone in a place like this. And then another person died, and then somebody was born, and then in the past 2 years, he's realized that life does go on. And now we have this opportunity to be part of the rebuilding of New Orleans and the Gulf Coast. And people will live, and people will die, and it will continue, and it will continue. The pictures that I want to focus on in David Ray Morris's slideshow are the pictures of the faces of children. I'm a dad. I've got kids that are 9 and 7. They were, let me think about this, 9 and 6. Sorry, Miles. The 9 and 6, they were 4 and 7 when Katrina hit. I want to start this evening by reading, I'm going to read a few things this evening, but this is actually going to be someone else's words that I start out with here. This is my son Miles, and this is something he wrote when he was 6 years old. When he was 4 years old. I just can't get Miles' age straight. He acts much older than he is. He was 4 years old when he wrote this story, and my wife had taken it with her when she evacuated, and after Katrina, she showed it to me. He had drawn a picture, a lot of blue scribbles on the page, and a picture of a house. This was again before Katrina. And then she had written the story that he dictated to her, and this was the story. One spring day, Miles came out of his house in New Orleans. The sun was happy to see Miles. The sun was wearing sunglasses. Miles moved to his new house, and the sun got very hot. Now it was even hotter. A fearful, wild storm came with lots of monsters. Luckily, Miles wasn't in it. The water splashed all over. Katrina, for me, like for 500,000 other people from New Orleans, for even more from Mississippi, is a very personal story, a very personal tragedy that I still do not truly understand. This book is one attempt to understand one small piece of it. I decided that, actually I didn't really decide, it was decided for me 2 days after we learned that the levees broke and the water was rising up in New Orleans. I got a call from a guy in Washington, D.C. who works for the association that my old paper, Gambit Weekly in New Orleans, was part of, and said, people want to hear how you're doing. Do you want to write something for the papers? So at that time, I decided to write personally, that I would try to write as personally as possible, even if the writing came out awkward, even if it was uncomfortable. I would try to write what we were going through, what we were experiencing, and then use journalism, use what I've learned in journalism to try to connect my experience with other experiences throughout this tragedy. So I sat down, and this was, we were in Caron Crow, Louisiana. It's a small town north of Lafayette, out in southwest Louisiana, a Cajun town. There were 4 households living in the house that we'd evacuated to at that point. I count a guy and his Rottweiler as one of the households. A couple and their baby, myself and our kids, and then the people who actually lived in that house. And I sat down on the computer with pandemonium kind of going around. The Thomas the Tank Engine train set was right behind the computer, so all the kids were kind of behind me as I was doing this. And just wrote the first thing I could think of, which was, New Orleans is gone. And the next sentence is, I left it behind me and saw it through the rearview mirror. My kids in the back seat, the soundtrack to Shrek on the CD player. And that, at that time, was my last view of New Orleans, and it did feel, even though I knew the city was not gone, it felt like a city out of my grasp at that moment. Before I go any further, I'd like to ask, I can see when I put my hands up like this, how many people here are from New Orleans, are natives of New Orleans? Maybe if you just raise your hand. A few? How many people have been to New Orleans in the last 2 years? Quite a few. Thank you for that. When we talk afterwards, I'm a journalist here, so I'm always fishing for stories, but I'd love to introduce yourself to me, please, and I'd like to talk with you afterwards. I was a college freshman. I had decided I wasn't going to tell this story, but now I will. I'd actually dropped out of college when I first went to New Orleans. I was a theater major at Northwestern University. I was raised in the Midwest, but decided I wanted to see Mardi Gras. Like many people that go down to New Orleans, I was greedy for experience. I was hungry for music, hungry for food, hungry for adventure. And knew also my great-great-great-grandfather had gotten off the boat in New Orleans in 1840. His first job was digging the trenches for the victims of yellow fever, one of many plagues and disasters that New Orleans has survived. And I found that adventure. I worked in the restaurants in the French Quarter. I learned to put on a mask for Mardi Gras. And I began to write about music and musicians. That was my inauguration into the city. It was one of those moments, one of those interviews that I first began to, I think, understand and appreciate what this city is about. Having not grown up there, I really often would find myself in conversations and feel like there was maybe one layer of meaning going on that was just quite beyond me. I was interviewing a jazz, banjo, and guitar player and songwriter and raconteur named Danny Barker, who was at that point in his late 70s. He had written such jazz songs as Save the Bones for Henry Jones, because Henry don't eat no meat, and his big hit for Decca called Don't You Feel My Leg, which was sung by his wife, Blue Barker. And he had also played in Cab Calloway's orchestra, been part of the Harlem Renaissance, came back to New Orleans and became a teacher. Began teaching kids to play music and started a brass band that young kids like Wynton Marsalis got their start in. So I was turning my tape recorder. I was in his house in the 7th Ward, a house that flooded to the rooftops, and he was adjusting the microphone on his own neck, because he was a performer. He wasn't going to have me do anything. He was going to put the microphone on. And I didn't even hear that he was saying this, actually. It wasn't until I went back and listened to the tape, because he was talking under his breath as he was putting the microphone on. This is what Danny Barker said. I'll be using my intelligent voice now. I have 10 different voices. My intelligent voice, my jazz voice, my nightlife voice, my day life voice, black northern voice, black southern voice. That's interesting, huh? All the various voices you have to have when you have a brown or black paint job. I started to understand New Orleans a little bit better then. Over time, I settled into a job as editor of the weekly newspaper, moved to a house because it was a block away from a wonderful public school. It's still there, and fell into a very happy routine. We had family Mardi Gras then. You pack the kids up, you get a ladder, you sit on the parade route, you get a box of Popeye's chicken, you meet your other friends there. We had snowballs in the summer. It's not shaved ice, it's snowed ice. It's an incredible way of eating ice. We'd eat those in the summertime. We had our favorite snowball stands, and we had evacuations. That became part of our summer routine. In fact, the kids started calling them evacuations. They look for you, pack up the car, you throw the cats in the back seat. That made it different than a regular trip. And we head out of town for a day or two. We were facing another one of those on Friday, August 26, 2005. At 10 o'clock that night, I saw the news and told my wife it looked like we'd be heading out for the weekend. She's a pediatrician. She was on call. So her plan was to stay behind. If it got really bad, she'd go to the Times-Picayune, the daily newspaper office where friends of mine worked, and it was on high ground, had its own generator. That was her plan. Saturday we left. Two other families, the Poches and the Houstons, lived up the street from us. We walked up and got together with them, made plans. We were going to end up in Lafayette, Louisiana. We were going to go to this place called Dino's on Sunday that serves crawfish pizza. It was our evacuation plan. But things had gotten different. And I remember that day when I was packing up the car and getting ready to go. For some reason, I don't know if you do this, but I find that I start humming songs about something before I really am aware what the song is about. I'm not really thinking on that level, but for some reason the song comes to my mind. And I started humming all the Woody Guthrie songs from the Dust Bowl ballads that he wrote about the Great Migration after the Dust Bowl. Songs like, lots of folks back home, they say, leaving home every day, beating that hot and dusty way to the California shore. They think they're going, it goes on, and they think they're going, I just have to sing it, I can't say it. They think they're going to Sugar Bowl, but this is what they find. The police at the port of entry say, you're number 14,000 for today. If you ain't got the do-re-mi, folks, you ain't got the do-re-mi, you better go back. You better go back. These songs, and So Long It's Been Good to Know You, about people leaving as the dust storm was rolling, started coming to my mind. We loaded up the car, said goodbye to Tammy, got there Saturday. Sunday morning, the mandatory evacuation was called by the mayor. Tammy called me after much difficulty getting through. I heard a sound of fear in her voice that I never want to hear again. She got in the car, she had the cats, she loaded up the cats in the car and made it there late Sunday night, and we settled down after the kids were asleep to watch the same show that you all were watching. That swirly knot coming closer and closer to the coastline. All the predictions, phrases like toxic gumbo. Then came Monday, beautiful Monday. After we found out that the storm had actually kind of spared New Orleans, we knew there was going to be work to be done. We knew that people had suffered. We knew there would be neighborhoods that would not look the same. But we believed we were coming back at the end of that week. And that was before we found out that the levee walls had buckled under the weight of the water from Lake Pontchartrain, a buckling that was not supposed to happen. These levees were supposed to withstand the fast-moving Category 2, slow-moving Category 3 storm that finally did hit New Orleans. So we started hearing the water was rising. We started hearing this as rumors. We didn't know. Our phones didn't work. We started texting, "Are you okay?" to anybody that we could think of. I started thinking about people I wouldn't find out for weeks and weeks what happened. I started thinking about Katie, who had called Tammy on Saturday saying she's having her baby. Do you think the hospital's a safe place to go? And Tammy says the safest place in town to go to the hospital. I started thinking about Urema and the Yosipieves, a family. Urema was my daughter's first friend. They were 6 months old together. And we knew they never left town for evacuations. His father's a doctor, and they always went to Tulane Hospital. For weeks, we'd find out that he had clutched his mother, and said, I'm going to die, I'm going to die, I'm going to die, over and over again. This is a bright-eyed, quick-to-laugh boy. He now checks the weather every day to see if a storm is coming, and he has panic attacks anytime there is rain. And so, but we found ourselves in Carencro. We got out. My daughter said, sometime around Tuesday or Wednesday, I'm not exactly sure when, Dad, I'm getting kind of bored of not having school. She looks back now, she's read this book, and she says, I didn't say that. I didn't say I didn't say I was bored of not having school. Yeah, she said she was bored of not having school. And we faced another decision, because Katrina hit the first week of school. And you all know what the first week of school is like. The excitement of your teacher your kids got the teacher you're hoping the kids would get. You're signing up for the arts classes, you're signing up for the teams. Everything's starting, the first homework assignments come in. We faced that decision. That group we had met for crawfish pizza on Sunday. We had stayed together. George's mother was also in a hospital. She ended up not making it very much longer. It was a different mood. We're facing different kinds of decisions. But we had stayed together, this group of us that evacuated together. And it was our last splinter of New Orleans, 3 families. And we started talking, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to put our kids in the schools here. Lafayette schools, as did many school districts, I'm quite sure the one around here too, did an amazing job bringing New Orleans kids and Gulf Coast kids into the schools. And 6,000 kids within the first couple weeks registered in Lafayette. And that was going to be our decision. We're going to put the kids in Lafayette school. But we kept stopping. We kept not signing that form, because the thought of splitting them apart now into different grades and different schools was unbearable to us. Because every day we got together and they played and they saw each other, and that was it. That was our last thing, it felt like. And then it was remembered that there was a teacher, Cecilia's teacher, my daughter's first grade teacher, always went to New Iberia to evacuate. Yeah, last year he went to New Iberia to evacuate. That's where he goes. New Iberia is about 30 minutes south of Carencro. What if we started our own school? What if we got Mr. Reno to sign on to this kind of crazy idea? Now, you have to understand, I'm going to back up a little bit and tell you about Mr. Reno, what kind of teacher he is. I was playing chess with my daughter, and I saw her write something and scribble it out when she was in first grade. And of course, this is the curse of having a father who's a journalist. When she got up and went, I kind of went and curiously saw what she had done, and she had drawn a heart, and inside that heart had written Mr. R. At the end of the school year, Mr. R makes a poster and writes a long letter to each kid in the class, specifically talking about the different experiences they had, what it was like, what it looked like. That letter is my daughter's prized possession, and in fact, we ended up moving. We had to relocate to the Chicago area. And she had a rough transition getting back into her school, and we dug up that letter, laminated it at Kinko's, and put it up on her wall, and she read it every night. And that's the guy that was in our area, Mr. Reno. So it was my job to call him up, because I knew him the best. Now, where we were staying, there was this back patio, and that's where we went to have the sensitive conversations. That's where, when we were talking about moving, we went to this back patio. There were geckos hopping around. It was a beautiful Louisiana sort of a field back there with a fence and some lawn chair. And the kids sort of knew you don't want to go back there when the grown-ups are talking. So I took the phone back there and called Mr. Reno, got his number. This is a little embarrassing to remember, but I actually, how you're calling somebody for the first date in high school and you actually make almost all the numbers and then you stop and hang up? I actually did that with Mr. Reno. I can't do this. Okay, so the phone rings and he picks it up, and it's his voice. And I can't describe to you how beautiful every single voice sounded. I hadn't heard his voice since the hurricane, since the evacuation. It was Mr. Reno. He said, hello. I said, Mr. Reno, it's Michael Tisserand, Cecilia's dad. How are you doing? He said, I'm doing great. Well, nobody was doing great. That was a shock. He already threw me off balance with that one. So I stammered and got it out. Well, I'm here, the Poches are here, the Houstons are here, I think there's a few other families. We're thinking of entering the schools here, but we got this idea of starting a one-room schoolhouse, and we want you to be it. And he replied without hesitating. He said, that's the best idea I've heard since the hurricane. We'd started. It was not important to Mr. Reno that we have chairs or desks or books or school supplies. He said, all we need is a starting date. Pick a date, stick to it, we're good to go. And indeed, that's what we did. We found a building in New Iberia. There was about 10 kids to start out the process. The parents got together and named the school. We thought we had a wonderful name, Willow Street Sanctuary. I can tell you right now, I would not be here if I came to a publisher and said, I have this idea for a book, it's called Willow Street Sanctuary. And no kid would want to go to a school called Willow Street Sanctuary. This was what the parents came up with. Obviously, we needed a different name. So that was the first class. Mr. Reno said, we got to name our school, and he took his suggestions. And Olivia Houston, a third grader at the time, said, well, all I see are sugarcane fields now. That's what they see, that's where they are. And that became the first lesson of Sugarcane Academy that Paul Reno ended up taking to a high art form, is teach the kids about where they are. They've landed in a safe place. Their first field trip was to a field, was to a sugarcane field. They broke open the stalks of sugarcane and found out it tasted terrible. They went to the Tabasco factory after it opened from Hurricane Rita and dared each other to put Tabasco on their tongues and saw a cougar out on Avery Island. They went to a replication of a Cajun village and actually saw a one-room schoolhouse. And they started, I don't want to give the wrong sense that Mr. Reno is not sort of the Patch Adams of education. This was not necessarily nothing wrong with Patch Adams, but this was not Mr. Reno. He's a very understated guy, and he actually evacuated with the Louisiana State curriculum on his laptop. So he set up, he said, you know, so remember that as you go into, you are going into teaching, always evacuate with the state curriculum in your laptop. And he set this up. He started teaching them spelling. The first day, the kids learned how to spell evacuate and hurricane and sugarcane. They were writing in hurricane journals. He had essay questions for them. Science is extremely important to Mr. Reno as a teacher, and he was teaching them the science of hurricanes. One of the questions that he wrote on the top of a worksheet, what do you think New Orleans looks like, sounds like, feels like, and smells like? Walker Houston, who was in kindergarten then, wrote, it sounds like boom, crash, smash. My daughter wrote in her own journal questions that were much more direct than anything that she had asked my wife or myself. What happened to my town? What does it look like? When can I go back? Does it miss me? Mr. Reno's philosophy was in education, besides take a lot of field trips, was that there's a time for making plans and a time for setting plans aside. And I do suspect that, among other reasons, he took this job, so to speak, was that he always wanted to run the kind of school that he wanted to run. This was a chance, he called it pure teaching. There was nobody breathing down his neck saying your 45 minutes of numeracy are up, it's time to go to literacy now. Being from New Orleans, a New Orleans native, he used the language of jazz to describe teaching, that if he was riffing, he didn't want to stop riffing. That school went on, it was an oasis, I can't tell you. It was, I guess, good for the kids, but it was amazing for the parents. We were still trying to get in touch with people, still finding out who was okay and who wasn't. We were in line for food stamps for the first times in our lives. We were trying to get insurance, adjusting. My wife found out the first thing that her practice had folded. Her boss, a beloved New Orleans pediatrician, ended up taking his own life shortly after Katrina. So we were facing those kinds of decisions, having those kind of conversations. And Sugarcane Academy was, for us, the first thing we could build. It was an oasis. And then it came time to move that oasis back to New Orleans. Starting in early November, New Orleans was opening up again. We lived in Uptown. It was high ground. We weren't sure our house was okay. We were pretty sure it didn't flood. But people were getting back to town over and over again and coming back with more and more stories. And we decided that we needed to have Sugarcane there as a place to help parents get back. There were no public schools open in New Orleans at that time. It was difficult to find a place, but once again, Paul Reno said, give me a starting date and the rest will fall into place. I'm going to read a brief passage from Sugarcane Academy. This is about our experience going back to New Orleans for the first time with the kids. My wife, Tammy, was interviewing for a job in the Chicago area where we ended up moving. This was a source of great strife between my wife and I. I described this in some of my writing, actually. But we're moving forward. And I found out that it was a very surreal time. I found out that there was something called Fun Day that Rosie O'Donnell was funding in the city of Baton Rouge, and they were going to have the availability for 5,000 evacuated kids and parents to come, and they had spacewalks and moonwalks and bouncy things, and bands were coming in, and they had food, and they had Nickelodeon was a sponsor. In fact, we went to Fun Day, and we called up friends that had evacuated to Memphis or Mississippi and all different places, and we all met at Fun Day. The guys from Blue's Clues were there. That was maybe the strangest thing. Not the little blue dog. That's a cartoon, right? You all know that. But the guys in the striped shirts, and they were both there. And it was kind of like seeing the two Darrens from Bewitched, suddenly show up arm in arm. And I can tell you a few things about them, but I can tell you that one of them really doesn't like children very much, which my kids found out when they started squirting him with water. I won't tell you which one. If you buy the book, I'll tell you which one. But at that point, we met up with friends who had gone back to New Orleans, and we found out that New Orleans was open again. And I hadn't really planned it, but I decided, okay, Baton Rouge is halfway to New Orleans, let's keep driving. And I suggested it to the kids, and they reacted as if I'd said, let's go to Disney World. They were so happy to go back home. So we're going back to New Orleans. I'm just going to read this short passage about our experience going back to New Orleans for the first time. After their day in the hot sun, they fell asleep in the back seat. I waited until we crossed Lake Pontchartrain to announce our arrival. "We're in New Orleans," I called out. They peered out the window. Except for a few mangled billboards and a large self-storage unit with its sides blown out, the view from the interstate looked fairly normal. There were no checkpoints anymore. We drove easily into the Broadmoor neighborhood, where we'd lived only 2 years earlier. We had moved from Broadmoor. Broadmoor is a part of the town that did flood badly. The children started to recognize the streets, even though there were no standing street signs. Old refrigerators, strapped shut, lined the sidewalks. Cecilia read aloud the epithets that had been spray painted across the refrigerator doors. They cursed the president or FEMA, or they bore slogans like "Do not open until Halloween." You know about those refrigerators, right? It became sort of a refrigerator phenomenon in New Orleans, where what had existed in the refrigerators before Katrina spent 2 months in hot New Orleans, and that's why you would not open that until Halloween, what existed in those refrigerators. If you could get the refrigerator out of your house without opening the door, you were very, very lucky. Surrounding the refrigerators were mounds of box fans, beds, bathtubs, toilets, chairs, and toys. The kids' attention was drawn to the stuffed animals and dolls that poked their heads out of the debris. "That's not fair," said Cecilia whenever she passed a toy that had been shoveled to the street. We drove around and visited our personal landmarks. Treadway Pediatrics, Memorial Medical Center, where Tammy had seen her last baby before evacuating on Sunday, and where doctors and patients had been stranded for days during the flood. Ted's Frost Stop, a root beer stand where a giant mug sign toppled off its pedestal and now lay upside down on the sidewalk. Still there upside down, by the way. In fact, you can go in there now and buy a t-shirt with an upside down root beer mug on it. It's sort of a badge of honor. Boats that had transported our neighbors during the flood were now beached on the lawns. Miles looked out the window. "All the things in New Orleans are so crazy," he said. I turned down Rocheblave Street and slowed down in front of our old house. The water being a euphemism for the mixture of Lake Pontchartrain and sewage that covered our city, had risen past the porch and left its brown stain halfway up the front door. Next door, our old neighbors had turned their house inside out, and everything we remembered from 2 years earlier, parties at their house, had now been transported to the front lawn. The couch, the piano, chairs. We drove on without stopping. We parked in front of our own house, the new house. As I suspected, it hadn't flooded. When I walked in, I tried the electricity. It worked. It was a painfully familiar feeling walking through the doorway. Inside, it looked like a shrine to late August. The Sunday Times-Picayune, with its Katrina Takes Aim headline, still lay on the couch where Tammy had tossed it before leaving. Homework from the first week of school lay on the kitchen counter. Down the street, Paul Reno's car was parked once again in front of his classroom. While the kids played in the near-empty neighborhood, I walked down to see him. He was mopping up water that had seeped into his first-floor classroom. He was still dressed in the same button-down clothes he wore every day in school, but now sweat poured down his face as he hauled books and chairs to the street. The children all slept with me that night. The city was dark and quiet. As I listened to them breathe, I wondered just what they had been seeing, what they'd been thinking. And I wondered how I could teach them anything about what had happened to our city. The next morning, I found a box of cereal bars left behind in the cupboard. I washed their hands with water from silver cans labeled drinking water that we'd obtained at a Lafayette food donation center. Then I decided I would take a cue from what I'd learned at Sugarcane Academy. No matter how I might be feeling, I would do my best, my very best, to make this an adventure for Cecilia and Miles. At Fun Day in Baton Rouge, actors from the TV show Blue's Clues had passed out spiral-bound Blue's Clues notebooks and pencils, and I handed these books and pencils to the children and announced, "We're going to go explore our neighborhood." I told them how people had been helping to make sure that our neighbors are safe. They had painted on the houses to show that all the people and the animals were all right. The kids had all seen the mark, the painted red X. These Katrina search and rescue signs varied in appearances throughout New Orleans. In our neighborhood, the top quarter of each X revealed the date of visitation, most indicated early September. The left side bore the name of the National Guard unit or other search and rescue team. The right usually indicated if there were animals in the house, and the lower quadrant was reserved to indicate the presence of human bodies. When we drove through the neighborhood the previous evening, I checked for DB or any other sign in the lower quadrant to indicate that there were bodies, and there were none. If they were there, I didn't want the kids to see them. There was nothing like that in the blocks around our house. And as we sat down the street, I told them these markings were here to show that everybody was safe, and I didn't tell them the other markings in the city indicated the opposite, that people weren't safe. I would later learn they had figured that out for themselves. We turned up Plum Street. We couldn't walk on the sidewalk. Nails stuck out of plywood and power lines hung like strands of spaghetti from low tree branches. Swarms of flies were everywhere. With no cars in sight, I took the kids down the center of the street. There, Cecilia found an old spray can that had been left behind by a search and rescue team, and she made her own X on the pavement. We walked a block up to the Houston's house. Kiki was there this weekend also to clean up. They had left their cats behind a few days after the storm, found somebody to break a window and shovel dry cat food through. She was now there to haul out the furniture the cats had destroyed. The front door was open. As we approached, I could tell she was on the phone. I could hear she was on the phone with her mother. "Because it's our home," I heard her say. There was silence. "I know it might happen again," Kiki said. "In fact, I know it will happen again." We turned back without talking to her. On the way to our house, we passed another open door. It led to an apartment where Joaquin lived. The 5-year-old had moved here with his parents within the past year from Venezuela. He and Miles immediately became best friends. They used to sing along to a They Might Be Giants song about the letters Q and U with their arms around each other. We walked up. "Hey, Joaquin!" I shouted at the open door, but I immediately regretted it. A strange woman came out to the front porch. I looked past her and saw the rooms were empty. She told us Joaquin and his parents had moved out. They were there just the other day, had packed up a truck, and left. We returned to the middle of the street to walk home. Miles fell silent. "This hurricane is long," Cecilia said. That was our experience going back to New Orleans for the first time. And around this time, I decided that I wanted to try to expand past my kids and understand how children were seeing what had happened to their city. That mark that Cecilia made, that red mark, turned out really to be my guideline, that she was starting to make something out of what she had seen, starting to replicate it, starting to try to understand it through doing, which is what kids do. And I set out to listen to children. I learned you can't set a tape recorder in front of a kid and expect to get much. In fact, you can't really do that with adults most of the time. And that was one thing that Mr. Reno taught me more than anything else, is how to listen to kids. That's what his teaching philosophy was more than anything else, more than field trips even, was to listen. In fact, if you go to a class, and I sat in on a lot of his classes, they were led like college seminars where he would ask a question, people would discuss it, even 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds. They can take kind of strange turns, but that was what a class for him was like. And not only that, but he would even be open to hearing a kid say that he was bored in the class and see where that might lead. So in time, working as a journalist, I would start to try to meet the children across the state. And going into Texas, there was a charter school that opened up called New Orleans West in the city of Houston. There were 300 New Orleans kids there. And as I walked in, the teachers introduced myself and said I was coming from New Orleans, and the kids all gave me a standing ovation. Not because of anything I did, just I was from their home. I saw there a girl's artwork that they had this contest. It was a spirit contest. It was a strange sort of Olympics thing. They were supposed to draw what spirit looked like to them. I think they were supposed to get a lot of pictures of athletes, and it was an Olympic competition. This woman drew a picture of her mother and wrote, this girl drew a picture of her mother and wrote about how her mother got her through Katrina, and she has spirit. So I followed that picture and met this family and found out how they had been separated, how the girl had walked through water, how the brother protected her at the convention center in New Orleans, how the mother had finally found her in Atlanta weeks later. I also talked with the counselor of that school. She described how she would talk to the kids, and she would ask them to describe what had happened with all of their senses. And the kids described being stuck on a hot rooftop and what the hot shingles felt like under their feet. And they would describe walking through dark water. And every time their foot hit something, they knew it was a body. It could have been anything. Of course, it could have been a tire, it could have been a curb. The kids knew it was a body, and they knew that snakes were throughout the water. If you go to the New Orleans Museum of Art right now, there is an exhibit up, and there are pictures of some of those snakes. That's called Katrina Through the Eyes of Children. It's an amazing exhibit. Art therapists that went, also funded by Rosie O'Donnell actually, and others, to Renaissance Village, this Orwellian-named FEMA trailer park north of Baton Rouge, where for a time there was no playground, there was nothing for kids to do. Maybe a third of the kids in the grounds were in school at that time. And these art therapists showed up and had the kids start to draw what they were feeling, just as Mr. Reno did at Sugarcane Academy. One of the things they discovered is that houses were no longer a triangle and no longer a triangle and a square. They were now just a triangle. It was now just the roof. And it showed the people inside the roof. There are pictures of snakes everywhere. There were sometimes pictures of bodies. Sometimes these pictures were named for relatives that the kids had lost. The thing that gripped me the most was a raft made of popsicle sticks. At Mardi Gras every year, there's a king cake. It's a tradition. You get a little baby, a little plastic baby inside the king cake. Whoever gets that king cake throws the next party. It's a great tradition. But there was a picture of a raft on water and a baby outside the raft in the water, a king cake baby. The same thing's happening around New Orleans as well. The Children's Bureau of New Orleans is also working with art therapists to try to draw the pictures out of the kids. It was explained to me that the kids draw the picture and then they can talk about the picture. They don't have to talk about what's in their heads, because how hard is that? They can talk about what's on the paper. The Children's Bureau of New Orleans, which the Riall Committee and this endowment is helping to fund as part of this talk. So thank you very much for that. One of the girls that I write about in Sugarcane Academy, Casey Franklin, I reprint some of the emails that her older sister sent back and forth to their father, who's a state trooper and was stationed in New Orleans while the kids had gone up to Alexandria, Louisiana. They moved back to their house, and what happened after I wrote the book was even sort of more surreal. When they moved back to the house, which had flooded, they were all living up on the second floor, while the first floor, which had flooded, was beams and studs and plastic tarp where the rooms used to be. And then their house was robbed. Somebody climbed through Casey Franklin's bedroom window and stole some stuff from the top floor and somehow got it out of the house. So Casey started to get too afraid to sleep in her own bedroom because of this. Casey at the time was 7 years old. So she started sleeping with her sister. She started going into her older sister's room. And that's what she did one night when a line of tornadoes came through New Orleans. And pieces of the roof fell down on Casey's bed, which she had abandoned for her sister's room. Casey was not doing too well, and thanks to the Children's Bureau and the kind of work they're doing, she went through a program to help kids draw this out of themselves, to write and describe their feelings and get on the road to recovery. That's happening throughout New Orleans right now, and it's very vital, and I can tell you that all the people involved in it are very worried that the funding is drying up because of Katrina fatigue. And because this isn't on CNN, these aren't people on their rooftops, right? This is the psyche of kids who are Katrina's children. It used to be believed that children did not suffer PTSD, did not suffer the effects of post-traumatic stress syndrome. There's actually studies done with victims of Hurricane Andrew that started to give the lie to that. I certainly saw the first time I visited a FEMA trailer park and learned over and over again that all the kids were shoveling everything they had underneath their beds, whatever they had left, that something was going on for these kids. A recent Louisiana State University study of FEMA trailer parks shows that depression rates there have skyrocketed. When I was there, my guide showed me a number of trailers that he said he's never seen anybody leave. They stay in their trailers day in and day out, including kids. A study of 2,757 children who returned to New Orleans within a year of Katrina showed that half the children met the criteria for mental health referral. 20% had someone close to them die or be injured from the hurricane, and a third had been separated from parents or grandparents or guardians. Most disturbing to me, there is a headline in the Times-Picayune newspaper in New Orleans last Friday. The title of that article, LSU Mental Service Loses Grant. It goes on to reveal that the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to help kids work through Katrina trauma, that grant has been eliminated and $400,000 worth of services in New Orleans are going to have to be scaled back as a result. It goes on to say that the administration blamed Congress blamed the administration. There was discussion about oversight, and it sounds very familiar, doesn't it? It sounds like FEMA the week after Katrina. Again, this is away from our view now. There have been obvious failures in New Orleans. The levees and flood walls did not hold against the storm that missed us. As we all know, our country did not get drinking water to the tens of thousands of people in the Superdome for 5 days. We saw this, and just like 9/11 exposed our vulnerability as a country to people who want to do us harm, August 29, 8/29 showed us an equally hard truth, that we can fail our own citizens. Well, those failures are not so readily apparent now until you visit the children of Katrina. And thanks to the teachers and to the art therapists and the others that are helping those children reveal to us what we need to know, what we need to hear, what we need to understand so that we can understand what happened in Katrina. What can we do now? I learned that half the, I think it was 45% of the people in refugee camps around the world are children. I learned that from walking through your campus and seeing it written on chalk on the sidewalk. I think that is vital. Katrina is a public event, and we have to respond to it in public. It's not enough to complain to each other and to talk about it amongst ourselves. I think we need to be out loud about Katrina. We need to help make it an issue in the upcoming presidential race in a way that it really wasn't during the most recent congressional race. But most of all, I think all of us need to connect and reconnect ourselves to New Orleans. There are so many ways you can do that, and I know that many of you have already done that. Alternate spring breaks. Go there. There's lots to do, and if you go there now, first of all, you cannot imagine the effect on the people of New Orleans to see teams of volunteers coming through the city right now. I know somebody that said that his house was gutted by two groups of kids, one from a Baptist church and the other from Common Ground, this sort of slightly Marxist radical group. It truly did not, slightly Marxist, ideology truly did not matter when their sleeves were rolled up and they were walking into the guck of a New Orleans flood house. Consider teaching in New Orleans. I wrote an article for The Nation magazine called The Charter School Flood. There are more charter schools per capita in New Orleans than any place else in the city. Teach for America and those type of organizations have a strong presence there. I have very mixed feelings about the charter schools and Teach for America. I have great regard for many of the individuals working in it. I fear that it's turning a city even more divided between the schools that are working and the schools that aren't. It's a story in progress. But if you believe in charter schools, they're there for you and they're looking for you. If you don't believe in charter schools, those schools are there too, and they need you and they're looking for you. What time is it? See, I can keep on going. It's an invisible soapbox, but I'm in a soapbox. What time is it? 8:50? Okay, I'm going to wrap it up. But I'm going to wrap up with one more reading. This is it's a very short one. I told you that Paul Reynaud there's about 2 pages here. I told you that he liked to go on field trips. When we got back to New Orleans, the first field trip that Sugarcane Academy New Orleans went on was a field trip to the French Quarter. I wasn't actually planning on reading this one, so it's going to take me a second to find it in my own book. I'm going to see if I can talk and look for something in a book at the same time. We moved back to New Orleans. There were 80 kids, Sugarcane Academy. I ended up having a graduation ceremony in December. We passed out stalks of sugarcane to the kids, and they went on to the next step. This is our experience going into the French Quarter for the first time. Paul Reynaud stepped out on Decatur Street and put on his sunglasses. He was wearing a plaid shirt, brown shoes, and dark green pants. He had placed 6 sharpened pencils in his shirt pocket and kept one in his hand. He began checking off names. 42 children were running around, climbing on the parking lot barriers around the Aquarium of the Americas, which hadn't yet reopened. After the flood, when the aquarium's generators gave out, 10,000 fish died in their tanks. But nobody mentioned this as the kids now played outside. We were on Sugarcane Academy's field trip to the French Quarter. We walked along Decatur Street near Tent City for rescue teams that stood next to the Jack's Brewery. A posted sign said the encampment was government property and off limits to civilians. Blackwater security workers now guarded its entrance. We stopped in a parking lot and the children bunched around Paul. "Here's what you're doing today," he announced. "You're trying to look through what is here today to see what was behind it years ago. This used to not be a parking lot. People didn't drive cars. What was it? What's not here anymore?" He looked around. "Right here on this block, this used to be a sugar exchange. It was developed by James Ferret. He waved his hand while he talked. All along the street, he said, were buildings once used in the sugar industry. He led the way up the street to Jack's Brewery, a shopping mall that caters to tourists. Now, this big building used to be a brewery, a beer factory. You could smell the beer in the air when you came down here. My grandfather worked there. Claire Franklin spoke up. "Did it smell good?" she asked. Paul just nodded. He continued up Decatur and pointed to St. Louis Cathedral. "What did it used to be?" he asked. "A church." "What is it now?" "A church." That one didn't change. He told the children that years ago, soldiers used to march up and down Jackson Square. Then the soldiers were gone. Now the soldiers are back. The next stop was Café du Monde, which had reopened October 19. The kids filled the tables. When the beignets arrived, they blew off the powdered sugar till it clouded the air and coated their clothes. Paul next led them to Southern Candy Makers, where they're given small bags of pralines and chocolates, and on the way out, they passed a cigar store. Paul made a quick decision, turned into the shop. One of the older kids protested, "Mr. Reno, there's little kids here." But as men rolled cigars, Paul noted this was the last place in the street where people still made things by hand. Paul led the children across Decatur Street. Back in the parking lot, he offered one final lesson about looking at old buildings. "Remember, you can look right through something and see what used to be there," he told the kids. "The same way you can look at it and try to see the way it might become." That's what we're trying to do today. This was our assignment. Look hard enough at our city until we could somehow catch sight of its future. Thank you. I'll be open for any kinds of conversation. I'll stay as long as you all stay in whatever that room is called over that direction. Thanks.
Before you leave the auditorium, I would just like to make a final announcement and let you know that Michael Tisserand has donated a portion of his honorarium tonight to the Children's Bureau of New Orleans.